Cedar Creek Medical in Colorado Springs hums at 2 a.m. with the particular silence of a night shift, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, distant ventilators wheezing their mechanical breath, the fluorescent lights casting everything in pale institutional white. Hannah Clarke moves through the corridors with movements that could be taught in a military academy but would be written off by anyone watching as merely efficient. Chart racks. Medication carts. The supply closet restocked with precision. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 2 years now, long enough for invisibility to become complete. The day shift knew her name because the schedule board said so. The residents didn't know it at all. The attending physicians, the ones with the diplomas on their walls and the country club memberships, looked through her the way you look through glass, and that was exactly how Hannah wanted it. Invisibility was survival. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility meant no one asked questions about the scarred hands or the way she moved like someone who'd learned medicine not in textbooks but in the dark, under fire, holding organs that shouldn't have been exposed to open air. Her forearms were visible as she reached for the chart racks, the sleeves of her scrubs riding up just enough. The scars traced patterns across her skin, fine white lines arranged in precise geometric formations that told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. Shrapnel wounds. Surgical sutures. The kind of damage that came from working in a field hospital that had been under siege for 17 hours straight. The kind of scars you got when you were trained to function with your hands steady even when the ground shook from incoming mortars. The kind of scars that meant you'd held beating hearts in your hands more times than most surgeons ever would. But no one at Cedar Creek Medical looked close enough to read them. The night shift ER was sparse at 2:07 a.m. 3 nurses covering the trauma bays. 2 residents sleeping in the on-call room if they were lucky. 1 attending physician who'd be somewhere charting or eating vending machine coffee, counting down until sunrise. Hannah refilled the documentation racks with the mechanical precision of someone going through 1,000 repetitions of the same motion, her movements economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that comes from having your life depend on not wasting a single second. She didn't notice Dr. Marcus Mercer arrive until the air pressure in the room changed. He had that effect, not like a person entering a space, but like a storm system rolling in. His white coat was pressed sharp enough to draw blood, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a medal, his shoes polished to a shine that suggested he had someone else maintain them. He was the ER director, which meant he had the authority and the ego to match it. He scanned the unit the way a general surveys a battlefield he believes he owns, his gaze sweeping past the nurses with the kind of dismissive velocity that meant he was cataloging incompetence. When his eyes reached Hannah, they didn't stop. They slid past her the way water slides past a stone in a riverbed, present, acknowledged at the neurological level, and completely irrelevant. Hannah felt the moment he looked at her and felt the moment he stopped. She didn't change anything about what she was doing. Her hands didn't pause. Her breathing didn't shift. But something in her spine straightened another fraction of an inch, and her jaw tightened in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to read the subtle tells of a body preparing itself for contact. Dr. Mercer moved toward the vending machine near the break room, and Hannah heard the mechanical rattle as he fed dollar bills into the slot. A moment later, Dr. Trevor Hayes, one of the overnight residents, approached for his own caffeine run. That was when Mercer's voice changed, shifted from the clipped professional tone he used in actual clinical situations to something louder, something meant to carry, something deliberately performed for an audience. The night shift mediocrity is really something, Mercer said, his voice carrying across the ER like he'd turned up a volume dial. I watched one of these nurses refilling the charts like she's performing surgery. Chart organization. As though that's what separates the competent from the, he paused, pulled a coffee from the machine with a decisive thunk. Well, what separates us from them? He didn't look at Hannah. He didn't have to. Dr. Hayes made a nervous sound that might have been agreement or might have been discomfort. Hannah had learned that the residents of Cedar Creek Medical generally erred toward self-preservation when Mercer started in on one of his performances. The attending physician went on, his voice picking up momentum like he was warming up, like he'd been waiting all shift to deliver this particular lecture. The problem with nurses who've had a little field hospital experience, and I mean a little, is that they start to believe it translates to actual clinical judgment. Mercer continued, louder now, loud enough that the nurses at the station would definitely hear it. They think pushing fluids in some remote location while the power goes out makes them trauma surgeons. They start to contradict their physicians. They develop what I can only describe as a savior complex. Hannah heard the particular cruelty in the word savior. She heard the way he shaped it like an accusation. If it happens again, Mercer said, his voice dropping to something darker, something that carried the weight of institutional authority, if I catch any nurse, any single one, overstepping their protocols, contradicting my orders, I will have security escort them out of this hospital personally. I don't care how long they've been here or what they think their experience was. This is a hospital. There are hierarchies. There are reasons for those hierarchies. The vending machine hummed. The monitors beeped. A ventilator wheezed somewhere down the hall. The fluorescent lights flickered once, and in that fraction of a second of darkness, Hannah felt something shift in her chest, a familiar sensation, the one that came right before she'd had to make decisions that kept people alive or let them die. She finished refilling the chart racks. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She didn't have the tremor in her fingers that civilian nurses sometimes developed when they were angry or afraid. She'd burned that out of herself years ago, in a place where trembling hands meant patients died, and that had been an unacceptable outcome. When she turned from the chart racks, Dr. Mercer was still standing near the vending machine, coffee in one hand, his posture the particular stance of a man who believed he'd just delivered a performance worthy of applause. He was adjusting his white coat, checking his Rolex, establishing territory the way territorial animals do, through the assertion of physical space and the deployment of status symbols. Hannah walked toward him. Not quickly. Not with the appearance of confrontation. She simply moved through the space the way she'd moved through the ER for 2 years, like she belonged there, like the space belonged to her, like nothing that happened in her presence was out of her control. She stopped approximately 4 feet away from him. Close enough to have his attention. Close enough for what she said to carry weight. The difference between us, Dr. Mercer, she said, and her voice was quiet, not weak, not trembling, not angry. It was the voice of someone speaking a simple fact, the way you'd state that water is wet or that gravity exists, is that I've held beating hearts in my hands and actually restarted them. She didn't wait for his response. She didn't need to see the expression on his face or gauge his reaction. She simply turned and walked away, moving back toward the medication station with the same methodical precision she'd used to refill the charts. Behind her, she heard Dr. Hayes make a small strangled noise. She heard the vending machine hum. She heard the sound of Dr. Mercer's coffee cup being set down with deliberate force onto the counter. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing that the performance had landed. The night shift continued its quiet rhythm. Hannah moved through it like a ghost, present and invisible at the same time, her heart rate steady, her breathing controlled, her mind already 3 steps ahead of whatever the next 4 hours would bring. And that was when the ER doors burst open. The sound was violent, the pneumatic hiss of the automatic doors being forced hard, the rattle of the stretcher frame, the shout of paramedics calling out vitals like they were reading a death sentence. A Marine lay on the stretcher, his uniform soaked through with blood, his breathing labored, his left arm hanging at an angle that suggested catastrophic fracture. The paramedic riding with him was older, his face weathered in the particular way that came from decades of field medicine, from seeing things that didn't fit into civilian hospitals. Gunshot wound, left chest, 2 centimeters from the midline, the paramedic called out. Tension pneumothorax developing, BP 78/52 and dropping, respiratory rate 32, O2 sat already down to 74 and falling fast. We need needle decompression at the second intercostal space right now or he codes. Dr. Mercer had already moved toward the trauma bay, his expression shifting into something resembling focus. But it was Hannah who was already moving, already pulling the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, already knowing exactly where the needle needed to go and what the progression of vitals needed to be to confirm the procedure worked. The older combat medic, the one with the face like worn leather and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, caught sight of Hannah's hands as she approached the patient. He watched her set up for needle decompression with a precision that was neither hesitant nor panicked, just smooth and practiced and exact. He watched the angle of her approach, the way her hands positioned themselves, the 4-point anchor technique she used to stabilize the needle. And his entire body went rigid. "I know that technique," he whispered, low enough that only Hannah could hear it, his voice carrying the particular shock of recognition. "I know that 4-point anchor. You ran trauma ops in Helmand." Hannah didn't respond. She didn't confirm or deny. She simply pushed the needle through the skin and felt the hiss of air escaping as the tension pneumothorax decompressed, as the patient's O2 sat immediately began climbing, 75, 82, 88, stable, and as the monitors began to show what looked like the beginning of a recovery trajectory. She didn't look at the combat medic. She didn't acknowledge what he'd said or what he'd recognized. She just kept working. And Dr. Mercer, standing at the edge of the trauma bay, watched the entire procedure with an expression that suggested he was trying to fit something into a category where it didn't belong. Thursday morning arrived with the precision of a surgical schedule. Conference room B filled with 20 residents and attending physicians, their coffee cups steaming, their attention fractured between phones and the projection screen. Hannah sat in the back row, her charcoal scrubs blending into the institutional grey walls, her presence so thoroughly unremarkable that 3 residents walked past her chair without acknowledgement. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium like a conductor preparing an orchestra, his tailored blazer catching the fluorescent glare. He smiled. That was the first warning sign. He clicked the remote and Hannah's chart notes materialized on the screen, her handwriting, her clinical assessments, her patient documentation enlarged to lecture hall size. "This," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who had never been contradicted, "is what happens when nursing staff forget their place." He read aloud, "Patient requires immediate intervention. Recommend chest tube placement pending physician evaluation." His inflection twisted the words into something obscene. Notice the language. Not suggests. Not consultation. Requires. Recommend. Clipboard commander here is writing orders, not observations. A resident in the second row smirked. Then another. The sound of clipboards being adjusted, of pens clicking as people settled in to watch the show. Hannah's jaw remained neutral. Her hands lay flat on her lap. She had learned in Helmand that sometimes survival meant becoming invisible, and invisibility meant absorbing punishment without flinching. Procedural overreach masquerading as clinical judgment, Mercer continued, circling her notations with a red marker that squeaked against the screen. "Who does Nurse Clarke think she is, exactly? A surgeon? A resident? A decision-maker?" He glanced back at the assembled physicians, inviting them into his contempt. "What we have here is the predictable outcome of a nursing culture that has become dangerously insubordinate." Hannah's hands wanted to tremble. She did not allow them to. "I want to be clear," he said, turning full face to address the room while keeping one eye on the back corner where she sat today. "Clipboard commander has good intentions, I'm sure. But good intentions are not credentials. Intentions do not carry licenses. Intentions do not graduate from medical school." The third time he used the nickname, the laughter spread like infection. Hannah felt it in the room, the permission he was granting them to see her as smaller, as less, as someone who had overstepped an invisible boundary by daring to be competent. When grand rounds finally concluded 2 hours later, she was at the vending machine outside the ER corridor, inserting coins with mechanical precision. The coffee she selected dropped into the slot with a metallic thud. She was turning away when Dr. Mercer's voice materialized from around the corner like smoke. "Think a few years in some field hospital makes them surgeons," he was saying to Dr. Patterson, the chief of cardiology. They hadn't seen her yet. She could have walked. Should have walked. Instead, she stood 3 feet away, her back rigid, and listened. "She's been watching too much television," Mercer continued, his voice pitched low but carrying with the confidence of a man who knew he was among friends. "Thinks she can make clinical decisions because she worked trauma for what, 5 years? 8. The hospital is liable if she continues this pattern of insubordination. If she ever contradicts my orders again, I'll have security escort her off hospital property. We have protocols for a reason. Nurses follow them. They don't rewrite them. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Hannah turned. Slowly. Her movements had the terrible deliberateness of someone who had learned to move like a weapon, economical, purposeful, impossible to misinterpret. She walked toward them, and both men's faces shifted from comfortable contempt to something approximating concern. She stopped 2 feet from Mercer, her eyes meeting his with the kind of cold clarity that comes from having stared into the worst parts of human suffering and not blinked. The difference between us, she said, her voice perfectly even, is that I've held beating hearts in my hands and actually restarted them. She turned on her heel and walked away. Her footsteps on the tile floor were the only sound. No hurry. No fear. Just a person moving through space with the composure of someone who had already survived worse than a surgeon's contempt. Behind her, Mercer's face flushed crimson. She didn't watch it happen. She didn't need to. She could feel it, that moment when a man realized he had miscalculated, that he had picked a fight with someone whose scars ran deeper than his credentials. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, during shift change, Mercer's voice drifted through the break room in conversation she wasn't meant to hear. 3 different nurses. 3 separate occasions. Each time the same message, refined like poison through repetition: Hannah is psychologically unstable. She fabricates combat experience for attention. The way she responded to my feedback was frankly unhinged. By the time Hannah overheard the 3rd conversation, Mercer speaking to the charge nurse with the kind of false concern that masked pure malice, her hands had begun to shake. She gripped her coffee cup so tightly the cardboard crinkled. The liquid inside had gone cold an hour ago. Like her, it was just waiting. At 2,347 hours, everything changed. The ER doors burst open with the violence of trauma announcement, and a stretcher rolled through with a Marine in his 50s, his wife screaming something incoherent about chest pain and breathing trouble. Hannah was first responder, her hands already moving before her mind had fully processed the patient, muscle memory overriding everything else. The Marine's breathing had collapsed into shallow, desperate gasps. His oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had failed, and air was accumulating in his chest cavity, crushing his heart against his ribs. He needed decompression now, not in 20 minutes, not after imaging. Dr. Mercer was 20 minutes away. Hannah prepped the needle decompression kit, her movements shifting from nurse efficient to something else entirely, surgeon precise, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this procedure under fire, in a surgical tent in Helmand, while bullets punched holes in the canvas above her head. She identified the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She felt for the landmarks her body had learned to find in darkness. The 14-gauge needle went in smooth and fast. The hiss of air escaping sounded like release, like deliverance, like a single terrible moment being corrected back into possibility. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, his breathing eased from drowning gasps into something almost normal. Rodriguez, the older Navy corpsman working ER tech rotation, watched the entire procedure from across the room. His face went very still. He moved closer, and when Hannah glanced up, his eyes held something that looked like recognition, the kind of recognition that only another veteran carries. "I know that 4-point anchor," he whispered. His voice was barely audible. "You ran trauma ops in Helmand. That's a MARSOC surgical technique." Hannah's hands froze for half a second. The needle continued suturing. Her fingers completed the motion, the muscle memory completing what her conscious mind had not authorized. She met his eyes. "You didn't see that," she said quietly. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Not agreement. Understanding. The kind of understanding that required no explanation because both of them already knew exactly what had just happened in this ER bay. The patient stabilized. His vitals held steady. His wife, who had been screaming moments before, stood frozen at the foot of the stretcher, tears streaming down her face, understanding on some wordless level that her husband had just been pulled back from a very specific edge. Dr. Mercer arrived 6 minutes later. His expression changed as he assessed the situation, the patient breathing steadily, the procedure already complete, Hannah documenting the intervention with clinical precision. She watched the understanding move across his face like a shadow. Watched him realize that she had done something. He pulled her aside, his voice dropping to a hiss barely contained. "You performed an invasive procedure without authorization," he said. "This conversation isn't over." Hannah simply looked at him. No response. No defense. Just the kind of gaze that had made stronger men than Dr. Mercer reconsider their choices. When she reached her locker 15 minutes later, her hands were shaking. Not from adrenaline. Not from fear. From the simple acknowledgement of what she had just revealed. She opened the locker door and touched the folded flag inside, the colors faded now, the fabric soft from being held in the dark for 2 years. The flag from a teammate who hadn't made it out of Helmand. She had been so careful. So invisible. And in one moment, trying to save a life, she had blown everything apart. 3 days later, the sirens came. Hannah was restocking the medication cart on the 3rd floor when the wail pierced through the hospital walls, 2 ambulances, maybe 3, converging on Cedar Creek Medical like sharks drawn to blood in the water. She didn't have to check the intercom. Her body already knew. The muscle memory was older than her nursing license, older than the careful invisibility she'd constructed in this place. Trauma alert. Level 1. Multiple casualties. She was moving before conscious thought caught up, abandoning the cart midline and cutting toward the stairwell. The ER doors were chaos when she arrived, paramedics shouting vitals, nurses scrambling to prep beds, the controlled panic of a system responding to catastrophe. 3 patients incoming. 3 simultaneous traumas. Cedar Creek could handle maybe 1 at full capacity. The first ambulance doors burst open. A Marine lay on the stretcher, his dress uniform shredded and black with blood, his breathing labored and wrong. Not the easy rhythm of a healthy airway but the fractured gasps of a body failing in real time. Training accident at Fort Carson, the paramedic called out, vehicle rollover, crush injury to the chest, possible tension pneumothorax, pressure dropping en route. Hannah's eyes moved across him in a single practice sweep. Pupils reactive. Breath sounds absent on the right side. The telltale sign, trachea deviating left, the subtle shift that meant his right lung had collapsed and was compressing everything around it, suffocating him from the inside. She was 3 steps ahead of him before the stretcher even hit the trauma bay. Dr. Mercer was already barking orders, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. Get 2 large ball lines. Type and cross. Get me a chest x-ray, portable, stat. He was good at this part, the command, the choreography of crisis management. He'd trained for it. Read the textbooks. Never actually had to improvise under fire, which was the difference between a doctor and someone who'd held a soldier's beating heart in her hands while mortars screamed overhead. Vitals crashing, the resident called out. BP 68/42. Heart rate 146. Oxygen saturation dropping, 84, 81, 78. The Marine's color was changing. His lips taking on the bluish tint of hypoxia, his fingers clawing at the stretcher rails as his body screamed for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. His wife was somewhere behind them. Hannah had caught the briefest flash of her face, terror and incomprehension, the particular horror of watching someone you love suffocate in front of you. We need to decompress that lung now, Hannah said. Not a suggestion. Not framed as a question. The voice that came out wasn't the careful, deferential tone she'd been cultivating for 2 years. It was something older. Something that had given orders in Helmand province while IED fragments whistled past her head and bleeding soldiers waited for her hands to decide whether they lived or died. Dr. Mercer's eyes flicked toward her, irritation flashing across his face. I'm aware of the clinical picture, thank you. His tone was ice. Chest X-ray first. We confirm the diagnosis before. There is no time for X-ray. Hannah was already moving toward the supply tray, her hands reaching for the equipment with absolute certainty. O2 sat is 75. He's in cardiac compromise. The needle goes in now or he codes in 60 seconds. The room went still for a beat. Mercer opened his mouth to argue. Hannah didn't wait. She was already prepping the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark burned into her muscle memory through 17 hours of siege medicine in a field hospital with mortars walking rounds closer and closer. She felt for the rib. Found the space between. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that comes not from training but from having done this so many times that her hands knew the geometry of human anatomy better than her conscious mind. I said stand down, Mercer snapped. That is not your decision to make. But Hannah was already there, her thumb driving the needle into the chest wall with controlled force. The hiss. That specific sound of pressurized air escaping, the sound of life flowing back into lungs that had been starved for oxygen. The Marine's back arched, his breathing suddenly deeper, more present, the gasping desperation giving way to actual inhalation. She didn't remove the needle. Secured it. Taped it. Ran her fingers across the site once to verify placement while the medical resident stared at her with something between awe and confusion. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily. The O2 sat climbed, 76, 79, 82, 85. The Marine's color shifted from blue toward something approximating human. His wife's screams from the waiting area subsided into sobbing, the particular relief of someone realizing their person was not about to die in front of them. The room exhaled. Hannah stepped back from the bed, her hands dropping to her sides, her breathing still steady and controlled. The moment had passed. The crisis had transformed into something manageable, force running, blood being typed, imaging being coordinated. The machinery of modern medicine could take it from here. But something had shifted in the fluorescent-lit silence of the trauma bay. An older Navy corpsman who'd come in with one of the other patients was looking at her with an expression that made Hannah's spine go rigid. Recognition. Not of her face but of something deeper. He moved closer, positioning himself near the supplies as if checking stock, and spoke in a voice so low only she could hear. That 4-point anchor technique you just used. His eyes met hers for exactly 1 second. Just enough time. I know that from Sanjin Valley, 2011. Only one surgical team ran that protocol in Helmand. Hannah didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't give him anything. But the damage was already done. She could feel Dr. Mercer's attention shifting toward her, his earlier irritation transforming into something sharper. Something that looked like suspicion. He was moving toward the far corner of the trauma bay, pulling his phone from his pocket, turning away as he dialed. She caught fragments, significant concern, direct intervention, outside her scope, his voice tight and urgent. The Marine was stable. His vitals climbing steadily now, the immediate threat past. His wife was being led to his bedside by a nurse, her face streaked with tears, her hands reaching for his. That part had worked. That part had saved a life. But in saving it, Hannah had revealed something that was supposed to stay buried. The phone call Mercer was making now, that was the real damage. The one that was going to unravel everything she'd built here, the invisibility that had protected her, the anonymity that had kept her safe in a place that didn't ask questions about scars or calluses or hands that moved with military precision under pressure. She could hear him now, his voice carrying across the bay. I need the board on standby. We have a situation. Yes. Now. The doors to Trauma Bay swung shut behind him. Dr. Mercer stood in the hallway, his face the color of old concrete, and that's when his hands stopped shaking. That's when the calculation began. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket at 2:16 a.m. and made the first call. Board Chairman Fletcher answered on the third ring, sleep-roughened and irritated. Mercer didn't apologize for the hour. We have a liability catastrophe. My ER nurse just performed an unauthorized direct blood transfusion without consent protocols, without infectious disease screening, without, he let the pause speak for itself. Fletcher was already awake. By the time Mercer hung up, the chairman had committed to an emergency board session by noon. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Henning at Mercy General in Denver, Hannah's previous hospital. Mercer had trained under Henning 15 years ago. She owed him a favor. He positioned the call carefully. I'm conducting some due diligence on a transfer applicant. Hannah Clarke worked under your supervision 2014 to 2016. We've encountered some irregularities in her file. Unstable decision-making. Possible psychological episodes. Henning hesitated, long enough for Mercer to know the seed had taken root. Just between us, was there anything in her personnel file that concerned you? Silence. Then, she was always different. Quiet. Almost haunted. I never knew why. Mercer thanked her and disconnected. The third call was to the University of Colorado Nursing School. Registry office, third shift, a skeleton crew answering phones. This is Dr. James Mercer, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Cedar Creek Medical. I'm reviewing credentials for a disciplinary matter. Hannah Clarke graduated your program in 2012. Can you confirm any behavioral flags or psychological evaluations during her tenure? The registry clerk, trained to be helpful, checked her records. Actually, there is a note. She was flagged for a single incident, a panic attack during a trauma simulation in her final semester. She completed counseling and passed her boards, but it's documented. Mercer wrote down the date and time. By 4:15 a.m., he'd made 7 calls. Board members, hospital administrators, the State Nursing Licensure Board, even a contact at the Colorado Department of Health and Environment. Each call was precise. Each one planted a different seed. He never said she was unfit. He just asked questions. Questions had a way of becoming assumptions. The outside investigator arrived at 7:44 a.m. Dr. Wendy Chow from the Colorado Hospital Regulatory Commission, gray suit, gray hair, gray eyes that had seen every kind of institutional scandal. She carried a leather portfolio and a clipboard and the unmistakable authority of someone who could revoke a nursing license with a single signature. She spent 40 minutes reviewing the transfusion incident with Mercer, listening to his account of recklessness and endangerment. Then she asked to interview staff. Rodriguez told her the truth. The patient was crashing, conventional measures were failing, the transfusion stabilized his vitals. But Chow had already heard Mercer's version. She asked Rodriguez 3 times about Hannah's history. Had he ever seen her act erratically? Was she the type to take unnecessary risks? The questions carried a weight that twisted the facts. The security chief, a former military contractor with 16 years in close protection, saw what was happening. He'd worked in enough hostile environments to recognize a coordinated takedown. But he had a daughter in college and a mortgage payment due on the 15th. He answered Chow's questions carefully, offering nothing but documented facts. Hannah was called to the administrator's office at 6:27 a.m. She hadn't slept. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed like insects, each buzz a countdown. The office was cold. Someone had cranked the air conditioning. Gerald Finch, the hospital administrator, sat behind a mahogany desk that had been old when the hospital was built. Chow stood to his right, portfolio closed, judgment already rendered. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative suspension pending a formal disciplinary hearing. Your access badge is revoked. You are not to contact patients, staff, or anyone on hospital premises. Finch's voice was careful, rehearsed. Chow watched her face for reaction. Hannah had been trained in interrogation resistance. She didn't provide one. Understood. Security will escort you from the building. She nodded and stood. The chair scraped backward. The sound of it echoed in the small office like a gunshot. 2 orderlies walked her through the corridor at 6:17 a.m. Colleagues watched from doorways, saw her walk with a security guard on each side, her belongings in a cardboard box. No one met her eyes. She'd become a cautionary tale. Dangerous. Unstable. The kind of nurse who broke protocols and endangered patients. The box was heavier than it should have been. Inside, a stethoscope from her first ER rotation, a coffee mug her night shift crew had given her 2 years ago, a photo of her and Rodriguez at a staff Christmas party neither of them was smiling in. And at the bottom, in a small plastic evidence bag seized by security, the folded flag from her locker. The folded flag. 3 days ago, it had been hers alone. A piece of ash from something that couldn't burn away. Master Sergeant Daniel Reeves, call sign Sledge, KIA, Sanjin Valley, 2014. The flag had arrived at her apartment in a box with official seals and a letter addressed to Miss Clarke. She'd never been Miss anything to the Marines. She'd been Captain. She'd been Phantom. She'd been something that existed in shadows. But the official world had no room for Captain Hannah Clarke. So they sent the flag to a civilian address for a woman who didn't exist anymore. She'd kept it in her locker, folded in a corner behind her extra scrubs, the only piece of her real past she'd allowed herself to keep. The only artifact that proved she was something more than a night shift nurse that doctors dismissed and administrators ignored. Now it was evidence. At 3:51 a.m., she sat in a booth at the Broken Yoke Diner on South Nevada Avenue, her coffee cold enough to skin over. The diner was nearly empty, a drunk at the counter, a trucker in the corner booth, a waitress who'd stopped asking if she wanted anything else. The overhead lights buzzed with the kind of weariness that comes from burning continuously for 8 hours. The vinyl booth squeaked when she shifted her weight. Her reflection in the window was hollow. Exactly what she'd spent 2 years constructing. A woman with no history, no identity, no edges sharp enough to catch light. Invisible. Safe. Gone. The waitress refilled her cup without asking. Hannah stared at the dark surface and watched the overhead lights reflect in it like distant stars. 1 sugar. 1 cream. The same way she'd ordered it every night for 2 years. She'd made a deal with something larger than herself. Operation Buried Dagger had been classified at the highest levels. A field hospital in Helmand Province under siege for 17 hours. 22 lives saved with a scalpel and surgical tape, and the kind of calm that only comes from understanding that fear is just information. She'd been Captain Hannah Clarke then. Phantom 6. MARSOC Forward Surgical Team Commander. She'd given 17 years to the Marines. She'd buried brothers and sisters in soil that wasn't American. And then the order came, you're officially KIA. Your records are sealed. Your identity is erased. The asset evacuation required a legend. You're the sacrifice that makes it possible. You disappear. You don't exist. You never did. So she became a night shift nurse in Colorado Springs, a woman with a pristine record and zero personality, the kind of person who moves through a hospital like a ghost. Efficient. Invisible. Forgettable. It was supposed to be safe. Supposed to be the life she'd earned. 2 years of constructed invisibility. Shattered in 30 seconds because she couldn't let a Marine die. The phone buzzed on the table. Hospital number. Text message, disciplinary hearing scheduled 1,400 hours Thursday. Attendance mandatory. Legal representation recommended but not provided by hospital. Thursday. 14 hours away. Long enough to understand that the board had already decided. Long enough for the lies to harden into institutional fact. Long enough for Dr. Mercer to have poisoned every reference, every record, every piece of evidence about who she actually was. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the system was working exactly as designed. You break the rules for the right reasons, you still break the rules. You save a life outside the protocols, you still endangered a patient. The math of institutional logic didn't care about outcomes. It only cared about hierarchy. And Hannah Clarke, night shift nurse, temporary, invisible, had challenged Dr. James Mercer's authority in front of witnesses. She was going to be destroyed for it. Hannah lifted the cold coffee to her lips and drank it anyway. The bitterness coated her tongue like ash. Outside, Colorado Springs was sleeping. 14 hours until the hearing. 14 hours for Mercer to prepare, for the board to reinforce their decision, for the system to close ranks. She set the cup down carefully and felt the weight of it, not the coffee, but the burden of a name that had been legally dead for 4 years, a rank that existed only in classified files, a history that had been officially erased. She was a ghost trying to live as a woman. And ghosts, by definition, couldn't defend themselves. The waitress refilled the cup again. This time Hannah noticed. Long night, the waitress asked. Ending soon, Hannah said. It wasn't a lie. Just incomplete. She paid cash and left at 4:17 a.m., stepping out into the pre-dawn Colorado cold. Her car was parked 3 blocks away. Her apartment was 4 miles north. Thursday was waiting. The hearing was waiting. And somewhere in a hospital locker, a folded flag sat as evidence of a life she'd been ordered to forget. The doors to her past were opening whether she was ready or not. The question wasn't whether they'd destroy her. The question was what came after everything fell apart. The question was whether being dead on paper meant you couldn't come back to life. Thursday afternoon. The disciplinary hearing convened at 1,400 hours in Cedar Creek Medical's executive boardroom on the 5th floor. Mahogany table. 7 hospital administrators arranged like judges, their expressions tight with the gravity of what they believed was a liability nightmare. Dr. Mercer sat at the head of the table, a folder of documentation before him, his posture the confident slouch of a man who had already won the political battle before anyone called the hearing to order. He was smoothing his tie when Hannah was escorted in by security, her badge temporarily returned just for this proceeding. She wore her scrubs because she owned nothing else that mattered. The hospital's legal counsel sat to the administrator's right, pen poised, already drafting the termination letter in his mind. The administrator at the center began. Dr. Mercer, your concerns regarding regarding Nurse Clarke's conduct on the morning of the transfusion. Not concerns. Facts. Mercer's voice carried the rehearsed precision of someone who had made this argument to board members over coffee, over phone calls, in hallways where Hannah couldn't defend herself. She violated every protocol. Emergency transfusions are not performed by nursing staff. She exposed this hospital to catastrophic liability. The patient could have contracted an infection, could have had an immune reaction. He paused, letting the implications settle. She acted without physician oversight. That's not heroism. That's recklessness. The room was listening. Hannah stood with her hands at her sides, her face a blank field. She had been briefed by the union representative, don't interrupt, don't defend, let them have their version. That was the strategy of the powerless. Then the doors opened. A wheelchair rolled in slowly. The young Marine Sergeant Hannah had pulled back from the edge was awake now, pale but present, wheeled by an orderly who positioned him at the table's end. Sergeant Kovac's jaw was tight with pain, but his eyes found Hannah immediately. The room shifted. This was supposed to be a procedural hearing, not a reckoning. I want to testify, Kovac said. His voice still carried the rasp of someone who had spent hours intubated. Before any of you decide anything, I want you to hear what happened in that treatment bay. Mercer leaned back, his expression still confident. He had anticipated this, probably assumed the patient would describe the violation of protocol, would unwittingly support the narrative of reckless behavior. But Kovac's eyes locked on Hannah, and he spoke the single word that turned the hearing into something else entirely. Phantom. It was a call sign. Those 2 syllables froze the room like a drop temperature. Every veteran in the room, and there were 2, the hospital administrator Chen and the security chief Santos, felt the weight of that word. It wasn't the name of a nurse. It was the call sign of someone operational, someone trained, someone who had moved through classified terrain. The back door opened. A man in dress blue stood in the frame, his uniform bearing 3 stars, ribbons dense as a garden, his presence moving the air like a change in pressure. Major General James Kovac. The sergeant's father. He had been sitting in the back of the boardroom for the entire proceeding, unnoticed, waiting. General Kovac stepped forward with the measured precision of someone who had stood before far larger audiences and commanded their absolute silence. He opened a folder in his hands, official military documents, letterhead crisp, seals visible even from across the table, and began to read. Captain Hannah Clarke. For extraordinary heroism during Operation Buried Dagger, Helmand Province, when her MARSOC surgical team held a field hospital under siege for 17 hours, sustaining combat operations while receiving effective fire from multiple positions, and performing life-saving surgical interventions on 14 personnel while maintaining operational security protocols despite. This is absurd, Mercer interrupted, his voice climbing. She's just a nurse. These documents are irrelevant to hospital protocol. General Kovac's voice didn't rise. It simply cut through the room like a blade. Dr. Mercer. You are not in your operating room. You are in a room with a Major General of the United States Marine Corps. You will remain silent until I finish. The silence was absolute. Mercer's face colored, but his mouth closed. General Kovac continued, his tone returning to the formal precision of the citation. This hospital employs Captain Clarke, who earned decorations that your medical degree will never qualify you to understand, let alone question. She saved my son's life. She did so while you were more concerned with protecting your professional ego than with your oath to do no harm. The general folded the citation slowly. Then he stepped directly in front of Hannah, and rendered a full military salute, his fist to his chest, held for the count of 3, the salute rendered not to a nurse, but to a fellow officer, to the decorations Hannah hadn't worn in 2 years, hadn't even believed she was permitted to claim anymore. Hannah returned the salute with the muscle memory of 1,000 formations. The boardroom had become a different space. The legal counsel had stopped writing. The administrators exchanged glances that said they had lost control of the narrative. The hearing was no longer about protocol violations. It was about standing in the presence of information they did not understand and were not cleared to understand. 2 figures in dark suits entered through the side door. Pentagon liaisons, their identification clipped to their belts, their arrival signaling that this matter had escalated beyond the hospital's jurisdiction. The senior liaison placed a folder on the table and began speaking in a tone that indicated this was not a request but a notification. Captain Hannah Clarke was officially designated as killed in action on March 15, 2021, to facilitate the protection of a classified asset evacuation in Helmand Province. That designation remains active for personnel clearance purposes. Her service record is restricted. Her current civilian employment is part of her authorized cover status. Any attempt to access, document, or discuss the specifics of her service record constitutes a federal violation. The liaison turned to Mercer. Dr. Mercer, we will need to brief you on the legal implications of discussing a classified military operation with hospital staff. Mercer's smugness had evaporated like water from a hot plate. His face was now the color of antiseptic, his hands gripping the table edge. Then the hospital IT specialist stood. Chen. A Navy veteran, his badge reading IT security, his expression the calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment. He approached the boardroom central screen and pulled up timestamp-marked security footage. At 0237 hours this morning, Dr. Mercer accessed the hospital's security system using his administrative credentials, Chen said, his voice steady with the precision of someone giving testimony in a court-martial. He initiated a deletion protocol targeting 47 minutes of footage from Treatment Bay 4, specifically the duration of the transfusion procedure. I was performing routine monitoring and logged the access attempt in real time. Every frame was preserved and reported to hospital security per federal mandate. The deletion never completed. The screen illuminated. Security footage. Timestamp, 2 hours 37 minutes and 14 seconds. Dr. Mercer's username logging in. His administrative panel opening. The delete command being issued. The counter, 47 minutes. The footage not vanishing, saved, preserved, documented. Every keystroke recorded. Every attempt catalogued. Mercer stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a sound like a scream. This is a witch hunt. She violated protocol. She endangered a patient. The general's voice cut through. She saved your patient, doctor, while you were trying to erase the evidence. More emerged. The liaison produced a phone, pressed play. Mercer's own voice, recorded 3 days prior, to a board member. The Clarke situation is a lawsuit waiting to happen. If we don't terminate her immediately, I'll make sure every medical journal in the country knows this hospital employs unqualified staff. The timestamp proved he made that call before any investigation began. He had orchestrated this. Orchestrated her destruction. Emails. Mercer to Hannah's former employers with false allegations of psychological instability. A draft letter to the Colorado Board of Nursing, accusing her of credential fraud. Text messages to residents instructing them to document erratic behavior whether they had witnessed it or not. His entire architecture of sabotage unraveling in real time, each detail another frame in a portrait of deliberate, calculated cruelty. Dr. Mercer, you are suspended effective immediately, the hospital administrator said, his voice now edged with something colder than anger. Security will escort you from the building. Mercer pointed at Hannah, his composure finally fracturing completely. You can't do this. I'm a physician. I'm board certified. I have 23 years of, she's just a. Security was already at his elbows. His voice echoed down the 5th-floor corridor as they led him toward the elevators, his protests dissolving into the background hum of hospital machinery. But that wasn't the worst part for him. Not the suspension. Not the immediate review by the state medical board. Not the cascade of lawsuits about to be filed by the hospital's legal counsel to protect institutional liability. The worst part would come later when his credentialing applications were rejected, when every hospital in Colorado Springs received notification of his conduct, when his medical license was suspended pending investigation. When the only work available to a physician with a destroyed reputation was teaching CPR certification at a community college, $18 an hour, on a Monday evening, watching adults in polo shirts practice chest compressions on rubber torsos. The worst part was becoming invisible. The very thing he had tried to do to Hannah. He would spend the next decade as background noise, competent but unremarkable, his brilliance reduced to minimum wage and fluorescent classroom lights. 6 months later. Hannah pushed through the double doors of the new VA trauma unit at Cedar Creek Medical, and sunlight streamed across her face in a way the old ER never permitted. The unit had been renovated, expanded, fully funded by federal allocation that General Kovac had secured personally, calling in favors from the Pentagon, making phone calls to people whose names weren't in the public record. The walls were different, no longer institutional gray, but a soft taupe that didn't feel like surrender. The equipment was new. The staffing was adequate. Rodriguez worked as her senior trauma tech, his presence in the unit no longer a courtesy but a necessity. Hannah's office door read, Hannah Clarke, Captain USMC, RET, Trauma Program Director. Inside, on her desk beside surgical journals and patient files, sat the folded flag. The one from her locker. The one from her fallen teammate. The one she had kept hidden for 2 years because acknowledging it meant acknowledging what she had lost. Now it was displayed in a proper case, a small brass plaque beneath it, in memory of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, MARSOC Surgical Team, KIA Helm and Province 2021. The flag was finally in the light where it belonged. A photo hung on her corkboard, from the unit's opening ceremony 6 weeks ago. Hannah in dress blues for the first time in 2 years, general officers on both sides, the decorations visible on her chest. 3 rows of ribbons. Silver Star. Bronze Star. Purple Heart, twice over. Navy Cross. Medals earned on her hands and knees in helm and dust, earned in the dark, earned when no one was watching and no one would ever know. Now everyone knew. Now it didn't matter. Sergeant Kovac had stopped by last Tuesday to introduce his daughter. Hannah Marie Kovac. 3 days old. The sergeant, recovered and returned to duty, wanted his daughter's namesake to be the woman who had pulled him back from the edge of death. The general had stood in Hannah's doorway while she held the baby, and he had simply said, "Thank you, Captain." Nothing more. Everything else had been said in the salute, in the citation, in the federal protection that now shielded her story. Hannah's phone buzzed. A text from Chen, the IT specialist. It contained a photograph. It showed a man in a community college classroom, polo shirt with a laminated name tag, Instructor Mercer. Behind him, a course catalog on the wall. CPR certification. Taught Monday 7 to 9 p.m. $18 per hour. He was teaching a high school volunteer and a middle-aged accountant how to do chest compressions. His face was the face of a man who had learned, finally, what it meant to be invisible. Hannah deleted the photo without responding. She returned to reviewing a new trauma protocol, a procedure for managing tension pneumothorax in combat wounded patients, classified information now being shared with the VA unit's surgical staff because Hannah had the clearance and the authority to make it happen. The knowledge that had cost her everything to hide could now save lives openly. A radio crackled, incoming, Trauma Bay 2, Marine with lower extremity wound, ETA for minutes. Hannah stood. She stepped out of her office, toward the treatment bay, her hand steady, her purpose clear. A Marine veteran was about to arrive, and she would meet him with the full weight of her training, her scars, her decorations, and her years. She would meet him as Captain Clarke. Not as a nurse. Not as invisible. But as what she had always been, what everyone had missed, what General Kovac had seen the moment he rendered that salute. She placed her hand briefly on the flag case as she passed, then turned toward the incoming trauma, her past and present finally aligned. If you've made it this far, you know what it means to see someone truly. You know what it costs to stay silent when your work speaks for itself. If Hannah's story resonates with you, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? Because those are the stories that matter most.